Violent white nationalists pose a dangerous and growing risk to the nation, and as the attack on the Capitol January 6 showed, a threat to American democracy. Elizabeth Neumann is former Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention and Security Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Currently, she's Chief Strategy Officer at Moonshot. Elizabeth, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
DHS Secretary Mayorkas called domestic extremists, quote, the most lethal and persistent terrorism-related threat to our country today. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. We started seeing that problem on my watch. In 2018, 2019, we had a series of attacks and incorporated domestic terrorism as one of our top priorities at the Department of Homeland Security. Every secretary I served under saw it as a lethal threat, and that is backed up by facts, by evidence. In last year alone, 2020, we saw a 69% increase in the number of incidents coming from domestic violent extremists in this country. So we have seen an upward trajectory for about 5 or 6 years now. It is problematic, and it certainly was exacerbated by the pandemic.
Why has this problem been increasing, though? What is drawing these individuals to these groups?
You know, it's a pretty complex answer. We've had in our country this domestic terrorism for arguably since its founding. There have been strains of this anti-government sentiment, strains of racist sentiment that have manifested throughout our history. The modern white supremacist movement and anti-government extremist movement dates back to the 80s. And you saw a lot of activity in the 90s. Most experts believe that 9/11 kind of shifted the focus of those extremists. We had a common enemy again. You know, we came out of the Cold War. Russia was no longer the enemy. So maybe in the 90s that allowed people to organize and focus on the government as their primary target. You get to 9/11, you have an external enemy again. So they kind of go quiet. If you look at the data, they're still active, there's still plots, there's still arrests, but it's rather quiet in those first 10 years post 9/11. And then we start to see an uptick. And some people also believe that the election of President Obama might have been somewhat of a trigger. And certainly some of the conversations happening in mainstream America, that things like the Tea Party movement or the Occupy Wall Street movement, there was just an anti-authority frustration in our country. And that certainly allowed a small minority to kind of accelerate and add to their numbers on the extremes.
Elizabeth, I'm interested to know why members of the military, members of law enforcement are especially being recruited by these groups.
Well, it is it's both sad and something we need to be more willing to talk about as a country. So these groups, especially the white supremacist and anti-government extremist groups, have as their primary aim the overthrow of the U.S. government. They believe, and the ideologies vary, conspiracy theories vary, but the kind of a core construct is basically the U.S. government is rotten for whatever grievance you might have based on your ideology. It needs to be overthrown, and there's likely to be a coming race war or coming civil war, and so they are either preparing for it, and others actually hold an ideology or an approach called accelerationism, and they're trying to bring it about. They're trying to conduct attacks that would disrupt society and maybe usher in that civil war faster. But it's all for the purpose of overthrowing the U.S. government so that they can establish whatever in their ideology is the goal, either a white nation or a return to our founders' principles. That's the drive. Well, if your goal is to go out and conduct attacks or be able to participate in a civil war, you need training. You need tactical gear. You need to know how to use weapons. So military men and women have some unique skills that these extremist movements want to be able to leverage. So part of it is just a practical mindset of we need to recruit from this pool of experts in our community. And the other side of it is that when you leave the military, or as you're, progressing through your career, that we know that for many military men and women that have experienced combat, things like PTSD can make you vulnerable to suggestions by these extremist groups. So I don't look at it so much as, oh no, we have a problem in our military, as much as it is that some small percentage of military men and women are vulnerable to potentially being recruited.
DHS announced in the spring that it will have an internal review to root out white supremacist ideology from within the federal government. What do you know about that? How big of a problem is this within the government?
Well, we know from a general population standpoint that this ideology has been growing in prevalence. The online engagement has increased quite significantly. The company I work for, Moonshot, was able to detect a 140% increase in engagement with white supremacist and anti-government extremist content in the last 2 years. So if you look at our society's engagement with these ideas and the fact that some of these extremist groups have increasingly become a part of the mainstream conversation, things like seeing the Great Replacement theory discussed on some major television networks, that you just have to recognize that with a federal workforce, you're likely going to have some small percentage of your workforce that's either susceptible to these messages or actually possibly very much involved in these movements. So what you saw out of DHS is a tasking to the chief security officer to update a number of things, everything from training to making sure that when we are doing the vetting of individuals for hiring purposes, as well as recurrent vetting that occurs as a part of your employment agreement, to be able to make sure that the questions that get asked don't just say things like, have you ever supported a foreign terrorist organization? But you're also making sure that people that are joining the federal government don't belong to a militia, which are illegal in all 50 states. So there's a just kind of an updating of our standards and training to make sure that this particular threat is appropriately incorporated into our screening and vetting.
But how do you do that while still taking care of privacy issues? I mean, do you access social media accounts? I mean, how do you do that in such a large undertaking for the federal government?
It is. I mean, when you look at a DHS, for example, when you join as an employee, you are certifying, you go through a number of security clearance processes, not just to get a clearance, but to just be able to work there. You have your fingerprints checked, they do criminal background checks. So there's already a number of things that are checked as a part of the agreement for you to become an employee. So some of this is the government saying, if you want to work for the federal government, you cannot participate in or support a violent extremist movement or organization. The challenge, of course, as you kind of pointed out, is how do you know? Like, we don't have a designated list the way we do with a foreign terrorist organization. There's a predefined set of foreign terrorist organizations that make it really easy for the government to say, no, you supported ISIS, sorry, you can't, we're not going to hire you, and by the way, we're going to refer you to the FBI. The movements that are associated with white supremacy, anti-government extremism, and other violent extremists in our domestic ecosphere they tend to be less organized, and they morph and they change very frequently. So that is a bit of a challenge for how do you set the parameters to detect when you're doing those screening and vetting processes. To my knowledge, that I don't believe they're doing deep social media checks. They might check open source information like any employer would, but I don't know that they have gone to a step of doing what would be tantamount more to a law enforcement investigation. Usually you have to have probable cause to dive into somebody's private protected information. So it is much more about screening and what people voluntarily share about their associations.
So Elizabeth, I would say, I mean, the larger issue, and you alluded to this, is that white nationalists are by and large American citizens with constitutional rights. So what legal tools does the government have to watch those individuals and those groups?
I mean, that's the challenge, right? That's part of the reason we were caught flat-footed. We don't have a lot of good data inside the government about these groups, how large they are, how they are organized. The FBI, when they have a case to run, because somebody has crossed a criminal threshold, can certainly investigate. But before they cross that criminal threshold, it's very difficult for the government to have any tools to address it. So a lot of what you see the government investing in is what you would consider non-law enforcement or non-justice related activities, such as prevention, which there's an office at DHS, the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, that invest in partnering with state and local governments and civil society in building programs to help vulnerable people, individuals that might be vulnerable to being recruited into something darker. So it is much more about, if you think about the public health model of, primary and secondary prevention, and if you translate that over to the security space, a primary prevention might be recognizing that we know that individuals that are prone to getting recruited to a gang or getting recruited to a violent extremist movement often have certain psychological factors in their background. How do we help that community that might have those factors in their background to shore up those vulnerabilities? So some people consider it a softer side, but we have to move upstream before somebody radicalizes, before somebody joins a movement. And that is much more of a civil society task than a government task. So there's a lot of new innovative things that people are trying and seeing what works. We have some success stories out of a few states where this is working, where we're able to help people before they cross that criminal threshold. And that's the best news for everybody, right? You've prevented an attack and you've prevented somebody from having to enter the criminal justice system.
Well, Elizabeth, this is a big issue, so I'm sure we're going to revisit it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.